All right, this is the second of 3 videos I'm doing on the Electro-Voice RE20. In this video, I'm going to figure out what's wrong with the mic, tear it all the way down, and fix it. In order to do so, I'm going to have to go deep into the mic, and we're going to get to see all the cool stuff inside. All right, so let's dive into opening and rebuilding an RE20. Okay, so we'll give it a quick check. Hey, 222. All right. It almost sounds good, except for the part that sounds bad. There's many issues that go wrong with these things. 2 main issues are collapsed diaphragm and loose internal phase plug. This to me sounds like a loose internal phase plug and possibly also a collapsed diaphragm. Collapsed diaphragms are an issue. I do not know a good way of fixing that, but if it's a loose internal phase plug, we can dive in and have a fun fix here. Okay, so the first thing to do to open an RE20 is you need a 0.9 millimeter or the equivalent in American. I believe it's an American screw, but the 0.9 millimeter hex works. And there's a small hole in the side of the grill there, and you can loosen up this tiny little hex screw. You don't need to take it all the way out. In fact, I recommend you don't, because it's so little it's easy to lose. And then you should be able to unscrew. Cool, and there's our classic vintage RE20 dust that comes out of here, because these things the foam just rots. It just crumbles away. So we'll work on replacing that, but we'll deal with that later in our rebuild. So the next thing we want to do is look at this phase plug diaphragm protecting mesh that's here. There's 2 little screws, and while you're unscrewing them, you want to be careful, because this nylon mesh, or whatever this fine mesh is made out of, sometimes has some glue on it that will grab onto these screws and start winding up around them. And so if it does, you want to get a little razor blade or make sure that doesn't happen. And you can leave the screws in this to keep them from being lost. And you can see there's some holes in there that have to do with the phase plug. And we'll set that off to the side. And here we can see that we have the diaphragm with its tangential surround. Good looking piece. And below the diaphragm, and I won't use metal here, let's use something plastic. I'll use this. Below the diaphragm, you can see that there's this black disc, and it's got a bunch of little holes in it. That is the internal phase plug. We can see that it's off center. Maybe you can see that it's not, there's more silver stuff there than there is there, and if I move it over here, it falls and it's over there now. So it's actually loose inside, underneath the diaphragm, on top of the magnet. We've got a loose disc, and that's what's causing that rattle. The next thing you want to check is diaphragm motion. And by doing that, you want to take your finger, and it won't hurt it to touch this diaphragm. It's pretty resilient. And I want to make sure that when you push it down with that disc kind of centered as best you can, get it there, that it has some motion. And this one does. We can move the diaphragm, and it doesn't have to move much. It just needs to not be resting all the way down. And you got to kind of get a feel for it, but that one is good. When they're not good, they'll just, it's like you can push on it, but it doesn't move. So if it moves and the disc is broken, we got something we can do here. If it's sunk all the way down over time, maybe heat or a lot of use, these diaphragms will sink down, and what will happen is they may work for voice or low volume stuff, but if you put them on anything that has a lot of low end, the diaphragm starts hitting the phase plug, and it is not good. All right, so we have a fixable mic here. Let's go ahead and get into it. So in order to do that, we are going to need to put this back together. So I'm going to just gently put these screws in here. Be careful not to nick the diaphragm. And this is, I mean, as far as mics go, this has got a pretty robust diaphragm on it. It's not aluminum, it's not going to dent, as long as you keep metal away from it. Another thing you want to look for on the diaphragm is to make sure that there's no little metal particles. If there are metal particles there, then you get some tape, masking tape, and very gently wipe them away. Or a Q-tip works good. You can kind of snare them in a Q-tip, wipe them around, and very gently lift those out. We'll put this back on because we have to go into the other side of this thing. We need to get into the back of the mic. And to do that, we're going to use a flathead screwdriver, a standard XLR flathead, and we're going to unscrew counterclockwise, and that should free up this XLR connector. And you want to be really careful. Don't just pull on this and yank it out. And there is some glue in there, so a lot of times it's frozen in there. So you're going to have to mess with it, but don't pull really hard, because if you yank off all the wires, you're going to create yourself more issues than you want to deal with. So we'll loosen this up, and we don't really need to do much other than use this to get into this screw here, which is a 9/64 hex driver. We'll loosen up that screw. Sometimes that screw's got a lot of Loctite, and you might need to really wrench on it to get it open. Once we've loosened up the screw, we can remove that and set it off to the side. The foam, as it rots, can get gooey, and so you can see it's sticking to this, so it's kind of not nice stuff to get on your arm, hands and stuff. Okay, so for this next part, we need to remove this end cap. Now, you do not want to twist it. This end cap has to be lifted off. The reason you don't want to twist it is there's a small post that, there we go, is in there. So we can lift this off now. We can see that this mic is actually a newer version that doesn't have the post. Very cool. I've never seen this before. Okay, so here is a Phillips screw and a little metal bit here that touches the sidewall. So they've eliminated the metal post, and that's kind of nice, and they've done it a little different. I'll show you what this metal post looks like, because I have another mic. On the older RE20s, you'll find that there is a metal post here, and that metal post has got transformer wire wrapped around it, going to a ground lug and dropping down in. And that metal post pokes through and then goes into this, lines up with this hole here. This can be kind of tricky in disassembling, and since we don't have to deal with it, I'll explain. What you would do to do that is you would remove these Phillips screws as you go. Once you remove this screw here, you carefully unwrap, without kinking the wire, unwrap it from the post as best as you can, and then you have a straight wire, and then when you're done, you're going to wrap it all the way back up. You don't want to do that too many times. Okay, so since we don't have the post on this newer version, that's wonderful. That'll save us some grief. You can see that there are some extra connections here. The RE20 actually allows you to alter its output impedance from 50 ohms, 150, 250. It comes from the factory at 150, but you can raise it or lower it. But we won't get into that. You can experiment with that. I just recommend be very careful when you unsolder these, because if you put too much heat, the whole tab will melt out of the plastic there. What we really want to do is document what we're doing. And this one's red, and this one's green, a light blue, and a black. Okay, so to deal with this, because this is dangling off of here and cumbersome, I'm just going to cut these wires and I'll resolder them on later. So let's go ahead and do that. The red and the green wire, and set this off to the side. Next, we're going to need to unspool these shrink wrap. Well, not really shrink wrap, there's a plastic wrap around them. Let me pull those off the wires, because we're going to need that length there. There's 3 screws now, 3 Phillips screws. Let's go ahead and take those out. And you don't need to remove the screw that's holding in the high-pass filter switch. That can stay where it's at. And here we're going to take out the little triangle. All right, so for our next adventure, we're going to take all these wires and we're going to unwrap them, and we're going to pull them into kind of an extended position here. This other one is wrapped around, so we'll unwrap. There's like this transformer wire wrapped around it. And we'll try not to tie any knots into it and extend that out. And I like to straighten the wire out. For our next adventure, look at all that dust. We should be able just to pull the capsule gently through the housing here and see all this beautiful rotted foam. There we go. Okay, and that's as far as we need to disassemble. We're not going to need to take anything else out of there. This foam is significantly deteriorated. I got a toothbrush here that we'll use to remove the excess foam gently. Now be very careful. There's some fine wires attached to the diaphragm that you do not want to tear. It doesn't all need to go away, but it's just messy. And then let's go ahead and get rid of this stuff. Here's our capsule. Now what really makes this interesting and is unique about the RE20, RE16, RE15, and started with this 666 is these tubes that come down the side here. And what they are, they're little brass tubes, and they've been cut away such that they let air in. And then they've actually hand doped them with little bits of glue to kind of restrict the amount of air that can get in. So each one is hand done slightly different. No two ones will be exactly the same. And what they do is these tubes terminate up underneath the diaphragm here. They let sound travel around the side, and some of the sound enters this tube at various places and comes up the back. So you've kind of got, it acts like a long gradual rear port, and it's got resistance to it. There's a very tight mesh. If you were to hold both ends and blow into it, it's got resistance to it. So it's kind of like a low pass filter as well. And that helps with this proximity effect. Sound coming, low frequency sound coming from the rear would enter this tube and then hit the front of the diaphragm about the same time and cancel out. Coming in the front, some of it would enter here, a little more would enter here, a little more would enter here, a little more would enter here. And so from the front, it gradually adds more low end as it gets farther and farther away, which gives it this kind of anti-proximity effect. So let's go ahead and see what we can do to solve this issue. Of course, we'll replace the foam, but we still got to solve this problem of the phase plug maraca. We need to find a way to get inside between the magnet and the diaphragm and glue down that little disc that's rattling around. Because as long as that's moving, we don't have a functioning mic. This is sealed on the backside, but we can actually get in there. This requires a sharp knife. And what we're going to do is very carefully. Now, we could disconnect those wires and free up and get a little more working area, but I'm not going to do that for this. We're going to score this around the bottom of this base plate here. And there's two tubes. Now make sure you don't cut into the wires. And there's two tubes and then this metal housing, this aluminum housing that all terminate into this black plastic disc. And we should be able to very carefully push on this disc. And they've used kind of a waxy, gooey type. There we go. And remove that disc. Next adventure. Very carefully, we want to remove this fiberglass insulation that's inside of the rear chamber tube. We'll set that off to the side. That's very light and fluffy. Inside of this aluminum tube here are 3 Phillips screws. So first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to cut away these 2 little tubes, and be careful not to cut ourselves. We're going deep. All right, so now, once we've removed those screws, we should be able to break off this aluminum housing here. There we go. Carefully removing this. I'm going to try and remember the rotation of this housing because it's easier to remember it than to figure it out later. So this mic, the older mics have a fiberglass in here. This one unfortunately has more rotting foam inside of this chamber. This is a very, very unfortunate adventure. So we're going to need to figure out a way to get rid of this foam in here without messing things up. I think what we'll do is just point it this way and dig it out. You have to be careful, but not too careful. You can't get to the diaphragm here because that disc is in the way. All right, now's the trickiest part. So what we need to do is get this little phase plug centered and glued back in. Using some isopropyl alcohol with the disintegrating foam can be useful because it turns the gooey stuff into, it dissolves it a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and clean up on the inside here. Now, like I said, most of the diaphragms that I've worked with, capsule I've worked with, have had fiberglass in here instead of foam, which was much nicer to work with. Unfortunately, this one's got a foam in here, and it's good to know. And, you know, they do change these things over time, and we can use this to clean up, but I'm not really that worried about the other foam there. Okay, so I've cleaned up inside. I'm going to get my CA glue ready. Get this top put on here. So I'm going to trim this nozzle down. Now you can get these little CA nozzles that fit on any CA tube. You can buy them on Amazon, like 50 of them for $10 or something. Or, they're not expensive. And we'll use one of our Q-tips because it's non-magnetic and use that to move the diaphragm into place. I'm able to move this little disc around in there. There we go, that looks good to me. Next, I'm going to put pressure on it so it stays where it's at. Turn it over. Get my light out. So let's get the CA glue out to the end. Perfect, and I can see it. All right, that should do it. Mainly, you want to get that disc centered more than anything. If it's a little off center and not touching the voice coil, you're going to be okay. If you get a little CA glue on the disc and it gets in those little holes a little bit, you're going to be okay. You do not want the CA glue to drip through the holes and touch the diaphragm. So now we want to make sure that everything's intact. The diaphragm is moving and it's not glued. I think we got ourselves a working diaphragm. I'm going to see if this is glued now by pushing on it. Hopefully it sticks. Yes, it does. Okay, so that looks great. We have a phase plug that no longer moves. We can push on it and we can see that it's adhesed into place. And now we get the fun part of putting this thing back together. All right, in the third video of this series, I'm going to take this mic that should be working now that I've fixed it and put it back together. We're going to rebuild it with new foam and get this thing back to functioning and usable, and then we'll test it.